Order. Questions to the Prime Minister. Question 1 is a closed question. Closed question, Mr. Frank Field.
Question number 1, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have no current plans to do so.
Mr. Frank Field.
Given that the current Cabinet Secretary said in 2009 that he, in his judgment, thought the inquiry would take a year, and that we will have had now 2 general elections before we see this report, might I ask him to write to the Chairman and get a date when this report will be handed to the Prime Minister and then published?
Well, I have written to the inquiry chair and I have expressed my frustration, but I have to say to the honourable gentleman that it is not for this government to interfere in how this inquiry, which was set up with terms of reference by the last government, is conducting itself. That wouldn't be right. But I have to say again, Mr. Speaker, that I first voted for this inquiry back in 2006, and members opposite voted against it in 2006, including, by the way, the Leader of the Opposition, in 2006, in 2007, in 2008. Even as late as 2009, they were still voting against an inquiry which would be here, discussed, debated and finished by now.
If there is a willing supplementary on this matter, I'll take it. Otherwise, we move to the next question. No? Lillian Greenwood.
Question 2, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Lillian Greenwood.
My constituents keep telling me that their number 1 concern is what's happening to our National Health Service. But in Nottingham and across the country, essential services are at breaking point. Given that our NHS didn't even make the Prime Minister's top 6 priorities for the election, shouldn't everybody who cares about our NHS vote Labour on the 7th of May?
I think what people need to know about our NHS is it is this government that decided to invest in the NHS, ignoring Labour's advice to cut the NHS. And when we look at Nottingham, we can actually see, compared to 2010, there are 158 more doctors, 646 more nurses, and the NHS is doing well. What a contrast with Wales, where Labour are in charge. I know they don't like to hear it, but they cut the NHS by 8% in Wales, and because of Labour, the NHS is doing worse in Wales than it is in England.
Mr. Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday marks the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, and I welcome my right honourable friend's acceptance of all the recommendations from the Holocaust Commission, which was set up by this government. Will he in particular make sure that the lasting monument to this terrible tragedy is accessible throughout the United Kingdom? And also, will he safeguard the funding for the Lessons for Auschwitz project, so ably put together by the Holocaust Educational Trust?
Well, I'm sure my honourable friend speaks on behalf of the whole House, but indeed also the whole country, in wanting to commemorate properly the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, but also to make sure here in Britain we properly commemorate the horrors of the Auschwitz for years to come, because the survivors and the Leader of the Opposition and the Deputy Prime Minister and I were privileged to meet so many survivors yesterday with their extraordinary stories to tell, but they can't go on telling those stories forever. So it's vital we record their testimony, we make sure that education about the Holocaust is maintained, and we establish this national monument, and 3 places for it have been identified, and that this work goes ahead starting now with all party support.
Ed Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, let me first of all associate myself with the remarks of the honourable gentleman and the Prime Minister. Yesterday was an incredibly moving and emotional day for anyone who is part of the commemoration. I thank the Prime Minister for the work that has been done as part of the Holocaust Commission, and I can absolutely confirm that it will be taken forward on a cross-party basis, so we do indeed keep the memory alive. Mr. Speaker, before the last election, the Prime Minister said he was going to have a bare-knuckle fight to save 29 A&E and maternity units, and he published the list. Can he assure the House that, in line with his promise, all these services have been protected?
Well, I'm very glad the honourable gentleman has mentioned the NHS, because I think before we go any further, he needs to clear something up. he has now been asked 9 times whether he made the disgraceful remarks about weaponising the NHS. Now, I think everyone in this House, and I suspect everyone in this country, knows he made those remarks. So he should get up at that dispatch box, he should apologise for this appalling remark, and then we can take this debate forward.
The only person who should be apologising is this Prime Minister, who has broken all his promises on the National Health Service. And he didn't give us an answer, did he? He toured the country, standing outside hospitals, promising that services would remain open. Let me tell him about a few of those services. The A&E at the Queen Mary Hospital, Sidcup, that is now closed. The maternity unit in Ilford, closed. The A&E unit in Welwyn, closed. Why did he break his promises?
It's very simple, Mr. Speaker. One of the most respected political journalists in Britain, Nick Robinson, the political editor of the BBC, said this, and I'm going to quote it however long it takes, Mr. Speaker. A phrase the Labour leader uses in private is that he wants to, and I quote, weaponise the NHS for politics. Now, that is one of the most respected journalists in our country. Will he now get to that dispatch box and apologise for this appalling remark?
This is a ridiculous smokescreen from a Prime Minister running from his record on the NHS. The answer, because this is Prime Minister's questions, is they've all closed. All of those units have closed. Let me give him another one. The A&E unit at Chase Farm, he stood outside with a local MP saying, hands off our hospital, no to cuts, no to closures. Is the A&E at Chase Farm open or closed?
I tell him my record on the NHS, 9,000 more doctors, 6,000 more nurses, hospital-acquired infections right down, investment in our health service up. But people rightly want to know what his motives are when it comes to the NHS. Now, if his motives are that he cares about this great national institution, fine. But he told the editor of the political editor of the BBC he wanted to weaponise the NHS. So I ask him again, get up there and withdraw.
I'll tell him what my motive is to rescue the National Health Service from this Tory government. And frankly, this is a man who's got a war on Wales and is using the Welsh NHS to make political propaganda. This is a man who has broken...
Order! Order. For the avoidance of doubt, however long it takes, the questions from the Leader of the Opposition will be heard, and so will the answers for the Prime Minister. That's the situation, and the sooner people learn that quite simple lesson, the better. Mr. Ed Miliband.
We know this Prime Minister is in a hole on the NHS, and this is all he can offer the British people. It's time we had some answers from him. Now, he's broken his promises on waiting times in A&E. He couldn't defend what he said about maternity and emergency services. Can he explain this morning why new guidance has been issued to some hospitals, making it harder for them to declare a major incident?
Let me answer that very directly. The NHS in the West Midlands, without any instruction from the Department of Health, without any instruction from ministers, issued a statement about major incidents. The head of NHS England was asked about it this morning, and she said this: I haven't been under any political pressure. This document was issued in the West Midlands. What a contrast between the operational managers of the NHS and the man who wants to weaponise the NHS. Now, the Right Honourable Member, he mentioned Wales. He criticised me a moment ago for mentioning Wales. He seems to have forgotten that yesterday he said this to the BBC, and let me quote. He said this: it is right to look at problems in Wales and to compare. That is what he said yesterday. Now, let's look at what's happened today in Wales. The Welsh ambulance service statistics have come out, and they are the worst ever on record. Just 42% of emergency calls are answered in time, compared with 70% in England. So will he now admit that Labour's catastrophic cuts and mismanagement in Wales have cost the NHS dear?
Mr. Speaker, the last time he was in charge in Wales, people were waiting 2 years for an operation. That is the comparison with what was happening. Now everyone will have heard, he did not answer the question. He did not answer the question about what is happening in the NHS in England. This is what the head of operations at one NHS hospital says, and I quote, "This is the enhanced criteria that has been introduced by NHS England to stop trusts from calling a major incident. The whistleblower says the hospital's hands are being tied." Now, the Prime Minister says they're not. Who does he think people will believe?
People will believe the head of NHS England, who said this very clearly this morning. Local hospitals continue to have responsibility to deciding whether to declare major incidents. It's perfectly clear what's happening, Mr. Speaker. He is clasping at straws because he's in a desperate mess on the NHS. He talks about Wales. Here's the record. Per head of the population, 10 times more people in Wales on a waiting list for an operation. Nearly twice as many ambulances failing to meet those urgent calls. Almost twice as many people waiting for more than 4 hours for A&E. That is what is happening in the NHS in Wales because Labour ministers cut its budget. But the reason he's in such a mess on the NHS is this. A week ago, the Shadow Chancellor said that every penny from their new homes tax would go into the NHS. Yesterday, the leader of the Labour Party said he had a plan to pay down the deficit with tax changes like the mansion tax we've announced. So there we have it. 99 days to go before the election, and they can't even have a sensible policy on the NHS. What a completely useless opposition.
99 days to kick out a Prime Minister who has broken all his promises on the National Health Service. And today's revelation shows once again the NHS under him is in crisis and under strain. It's a crisis of his making, on his watch, and that's why nobody will trust him with the NHS ever again.
What a contrast, Mr. Speaker. This government dealing with the unions to stop the action in the NHS. A Labour Party weaponising the NHS. Yeah. That is what everyone can see. He talks about what has happened this week. We've seen Labour casting around for a coalition with the SNP, a coalition with Sinn Féin. The first time in Britain you'd have people who want to break up Britain or bankrupt Britain. What a useless shower.
Mr. Stephen Gilbert.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. After watching that, I'm reminded of that famous Steelers wheel line. Clowns to the left and jokers to the right. Yeah. 8 months ago, the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government assured people in Cornwall that the delay over resolving the EU funding programme would be settled. 8 months later, hundreds of millions of pounds of investment and hundreds of jobs are at risk. Will the Prime Minister please sort out this pickle?
Yeah. Well, while I've done my best to run a coalition government, I do occasionally feel stuck in the middle with the Liberal Democrats. But what I will say is that it's this government that is delivering for the West Country because we're sorting out the transport links, we're sorting out the local growth deals, we're putting money into road and rail connections, we've helped with the vital airport and the routes back to London, and we'll go on because we want to close the income gap between the South West and the rest of our country.
Lynn Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Care workers deliver the most basic support needed to provide a life of real dignity to so many. Bathing, cleaning, dressing, feeding. Yet 300,000 fewer older people are enjoying that dignity now than they were 4 years ago. Is it because they don't need it, or is it because he has cut care budgets by £3.5 billion whilst cutting taxes for millionaires.
Well, what this government has done is put £3.2 billion of health money into social services already. And of course, from the 1st of April, the Better Care Fund will start, which will put £5.3 billion into the social care, something which Labour argued should be delayed. But what the question she has to answer is that the Shadow Chancellor said, and he couldn't be clearer, he said this: there will be no additional funding for local government, including social services, unless we can find money from somewhere else. But we've not been able to do that in the case of local government. This is what Labour do. They go around the country promising more money for this, more money for that, and then in the few moments of honesty, they reveal they haven't got any more money.
Does my right honourable friend recall that not long after the liberation of Auschwitz, the British Army liberated another camp, Bergen-Belsen, freeing 60,000 starving inmates, many who were saved by British medical services? And does he also recall that our allies at the time, the Russians and the countries of the former Soviet Union, in their struggle to defeat Nazi Germany, lost 40 million civilians and soldiers in that conflict? And should we not pay them some tribute too?
No, my honourable friend is absolutely right. We should pay tribute to all those who helped to defeat the evil of Nazi Germany. I think it is a good day to pay tribute to the liberators of Bergen-Belsen, the British soldiers that did that. At the Holocaust Memorial event yesterday, a tape of Richard Dimbleby's incredibly moving testimony of what he found at Belsen with those soldiers was played for everyone to hear, and we should be very proud of the role that British soldiers played in liberating these appalling death camps.
Sandra Osborne.
Mr. Speaker, last week the Institute for Fiscal Studies revealed that poorer families have lost most under his tax and benefit policies. What happened to his promise to be the most family-friendly government ever?
What the IFS report found is that the richest paid the most in terms of reducing the deficit. And we should be very clear about the figures. The richest 20% actually paid more in terms of reducing the deficit than the remaining 80% did altogether. But if she wants to quote the IFS, she might want to remember what the IFS said. And when they said this: we've had a great big recession. We had the biggest recession we had in 100 years. It would be astonishing if household incomes haven't fallen and earnings haven't fallen. That is the view of the IFS, and they're right. The view of the IFS is also that the Shadow Chancellor's plans are for an extra £170 billion of borrowing in our country. So if the Labour Party are going to quote the IFS, they should accept their figures for more spending, more borrowing and more debt. All the things that got this country into the mess in the first place.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will be aware that the Watford GPs were one of the first practices in the country to receive money under the Prime Minister's Challenge Fund, so that GP surgeries can be open 7 days a week from 8 o'clock in the morning till 8 o'clock at night. And I'd like to commend Dr. Mark Semler, who is the mastermind behind this. But I hope the Prime Minister is aware and would agree with me that this should be continued and would be absolutely excellent for all GP surgeries in the country.
No, I think my honourable friend is absolutely right. The Challenge Fund we've set up has allowed already 4 million people access to a GP surgery 7 days a week, 8 in the morning to 8 in the evening. I'm delighted that people are benefiting from this in Watford. I want to see this spread right across the country, and I think it will be an important part of the answer to relieving pressure on our A&E units as well.
Mr. Dennis Skinner.
Yeah. Well, if the Prime Minister won't apologise about the A&E closures, maybe he'll have a go at the following subjects. Why is it that we've got a record number of people queuing up for food banks? Will he apologise to them? Will he apologise to those that are on payday loans, struggling to pay them back? Will he apologise to those on zero-hour contracts, another record number? The truth is, this Prime Minister has got a longer record than his mate, Andy Coulson.
What I'd say to the honourable gentleman, he mentions 0 hours contracts. The government he supported did nothing about them. We've legislated. He mentions payday lending, an industry that boomed under Labour, regulated properly under this government. He talks about queues. What about the queue of people who've been getting jobs under this government? Over 1,000 a day. But I have to say, I thought the honourable gentleman might have taken a different tack today, because if you read the newspapers, you can get quite nostalgic. You've got Blairites fighting Brownites. You've got Peter Mandelson taking out a great big loan. I thought he might get all nostalgic on us. It's just like the old days.
Timothy Put a paper, Mr. Yeo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Britain's economic success is making it possible for the Northern Powerhouse to transform the fortunes of an important part of our country. Does my right honourable friend agree that investment in science, such as in the new Institute for Advanced Materials, the Henry Royce Institute, supports our top universities and will promote innovation which will bring back high-quality manufacturing jobs to the north of England?
I think my right honourable friend is absolutely right to raise this. One of the most important decisions we took while making difficult spending decisions was to maintain the investment into science. We've also improved our universities by making sure they're properly funding. And I think this combination of science and universities is going to be an absolute key to Britain's future economic success. And I'm delighted that we've got the £235 million investment into the new Sir Henry Royce Institute for Materials Research and Innovation in Manchester. This is a key part of the Northern Powerhouse project that is going to properly rebalance our economy and make sure we see growth and prosperity in every region.
Louise Ellman.
An absolute poverty up by 300,000, the rise of the working poor, and very seriously sick people impoverished while they wait for their benefit. Is the Prime Minister proud of this record?
Well, I'm afraid that the Honourable Lady's statistics are simply wrong. I know Labour don't like to hear this, but the fact is there are 600,000 fewer people in relative poverty than there were at the election. There are 300,000 fewer children in relative poverty. Inequality is lower than it was at the election, and you can now see 1.75 million more of our fellow countrymen and women in work. Behind all those statistics are people who are able to go out and earn a wage and have a pay packet and support their families. And I would have thought the Labour Party of all parties would want to support that.
Simon Hart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent, Kelly Thomas, has been waiting nearly 15 months for urgent bowel surgery. If she'd lived in England, she could have had this in 6 weeks. NHS Wales refused the treatment on the basis that it is technically available in Wales, although, ironically, there are no surgeons available to do it. Someone, somewhere, needs to make a common-sense and humane decision, and I hope the Prime Minister can help that happen.
Well, I will look at this case. I mean, it sounds as if it is a very sad case, but I'm afraid not an isolated case, because as the Welsh National Audit Office found, overall Welsh patients face shorter waits for treatment in England than they do in Wales, and that is the fact. And what we need is a change of direction in Wales from the Labour administration. Instead of cutting the NHS, they should be investing in the NHS. Instead of leaving the bureaucracy in place, they should be taking the bureaucracy out of the NHS. In short, they should be taking a different track so that we give people a better NHS.
Madeline Moon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, Mr. Speaker graciously allowed the all-party parliamentary group on motor neurone disease to use his state apartments for the launch of their report, which demonstrates that people with motor neurone disease are having grave problems accessing the funding that is available for communication support in England. 30% of people with motor neurone disease will die within a year. 95% will lose their voice. Will the Prime Minister meet with the Motor Neurone Disease Society to sort out why the delays are happening in NHS England? And will he agree to fund the communication supports that the Society can provide quickly and effectively while the NHS gets its act in order, so that no one dies without being able to communicate their last thoughts to their loved ones?
Well, first of all, let me commend the Honourable Lady for the work she's doing and others across this House on motor neurone disease. Anyone who's known someone who's suffered from motor neuron disease, and I've known people who've suffered from it, is that a most appalling, debilitating condition. And it's very, very difficult for families to cope with. So I'll certainly look at the report that she's produced, make sure that the proper meetings are held with the Department of Health so that everything we can do to support these people, and as she says, allow them to communicate to their families, with their families, up until the last moment, can be done.
Dr. Julian Huppert. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It is now quite clear the decision by the last government to put Hinchingbrook Hospital out to tender, with the last 3 bids under them all being led by the private sector, was deeply flawed and has been a massive failure. Does the Prime Minister accept that this experiment in privatisation has failed and that the future of Hinchingbrook Hospital should be fully within a public NHS?
Well, it's important that we make decisions based on what is going to be best for patients. My view is that there is a role for the independent sector within the NHS, but it's only gone from something like 5% of the total to 6% of the total. And it's no good, honourable members opposite, shouting about privatisation. It was their decision to allow this hospital to be run by the private sector. And frankly, on a day when they are in complete confusion about their health policy, you've got the shadow health secretary saying he opposes all of this but can't say what percentage should be in the private sector. You've got his deputy saying they want to see more of the NHS in the private sector. You've got the leader of the opposition refusing to confirm that his shadow secretary of state has his full confidence, and yet this is meant to be their great big election-winning idea. What a complete shambles.
The Prime Minister, his Chancellor and the entire Conservative Party like to talk about their economic plan. Where's your plan? Where's your plan? Your plan does not exist. But an independent report published yesterday from a group of academics shows... I can wait. He's in trouble. I can wait. Shows that welfare cuts merely contributed to cutting tax for higher earners and contributed nothing to reducing the deficit. It also shows that families with children under the age of 5 have been the hardest hit. So what future is there for the country with an economic plan that steals from the poor and gives it to the rich?
Let me tell you, by the way, it's the long-term economic plan. Let me tell him how it's going in his own constituency. And never mind the academics, let's see what's happening for working people in his constituency. Right. The number of people claiming unemployment benefit down by 31%. The youth claimant count down by 34%. The long-term youth claimant count down by 57% in the last year alone. Look across London and you can see 470,000 more people in work. Over 500,000 private sector jobs created. What I want to know is, when did the Labour Party become the welfare party? When did that happen? It's this side of the House standing up for hard-working people, on the side of work, on the side of enterprise, reforming work, and yes, reforming welfare to make that happen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the Prime Minister's long-term economic plan to rebalance the British economy, can I ask that he continues to ensure support for Britain's coastal communities, like Fleetwood in Lancashire, in order to make up for the 13 years of neglect by the previous Labour government?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right about the importance of investing in our coastal communities, and that is what we've done through our Coastal Communities Fund. So far, over 200 projects have benefited, creating or safeguarding over 16,000 jobs. I know that Fleetwood received a boost from the fund last year when there was a grant to Wyre Council to develop new tourist attractions, but I want to see more happen to help his constituents, to help our coastal communities, of which Fleetwood's such an important part.
Thomas Doherty. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will be aware of the remarkable work that has been carried out on the Clyde and at Rosyth Dockyard to build the country's new aircraft carriers. just as our country needs a new generation of aircraft carrier, Scotland needs a new generation of young, skilled workers. Will the Prime Minister guarantee that he will use the MOD's procurement power to deliver real apprenticeship opportunities for young Scots?
Of course we'll do that, and when you go and visit the aircraft carriers being built on the Clyde, you can see that there's an enormous investment in apprenticeship numbers and a huge benefit taking place in terms of that investment. And of course, the carriers haven't just benefited Scottish apprenticeships, but also they've been built in parts right around the United Kingdom. But let me make the point, we can only afford to make these decisions because we have a long-term economic plan and a strong economy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know that I do not need to remind the House that 453 members of our armed forces have lost their lives in Afghanistan, and many, many more were wounded, some seriously. And although we brought home most of our troops, the 400 men and women of 2 rifles are still serving in Kabul with great distinction in support of government forces. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that it's time we recognise the efforts of all those who served in this war with a commemorative event?
Well, I very much agree with my honourable friend. All British combat troops left Afghanistan by the end of last year, fulfilling the commitment that I made almost 5 years ago. On Monday, my right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary, welcomed to Parliament the final homecoming parade of our combat troops deployed in Afghanistan. And today I'm pleased to announce that we will hold a special service of commemoration in St Paul's Cathedral and a military parade on the 13th of March to mark the end of combat operations in Afghanistan. I believe, Mr. Speaker, it's a fitting moment to pay tribute to the extraordinary contribution made by our armed forces in Afghanistan over 13 years. 453 lost their lives and many more were injured. Their mission has helped prevent Afghanistan from being used as a base to launch attacks on us here at home, and they've enabled Afghanistan to begin the task of looking after its own security in the years ahead. And the whole House, indeed the whole country, is right to be incredibly proud of our armed forces and all who served in Afghanistan.
Corbyn! Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wondered if the Prime Minister has yet had a chance to place a call to Alexis Tsipras, the new Prime Minister of Greece, to congratulate him on winning the election, but also to learn from him why the people of Greece have finally said no to the imposition of the most appalling austerity, destruction of their public services, high levels of unemployment and deepening poverty. Will he use his good offices within the European Union to ensure they do get the debt write-off they're so desperately seeking in order to restore Greece to the prosperity that it deserves to enjoy?
I have had the privilege of speaking to the new Greek Prime Minister. Indeed, I asked him what his long-term economic plan was. But what I think is absolutely key to recognise is that over the last 4 years, we've seen the British deficit come down, we've seen jobs created, the economy bigger than it was before the crash, whereas in Greece, they've had repeated economic failures, and you can hardly blame them for wanting to take a different approach. I hope good sense will prevail on all sides, and as I said to the Greek Prime Minister, there are areas we can work together, not least because Britain has led the world on tax transparency, making sure companies pay the taxes that they should, something that needs to happen in Greece as well as the rest of the European Union.
Mr. Speaker, general practitioner recruitment is a problem nationally, but particularly for rural practices. Many GP practices on both sides of the England-Wales border serve patients from both nations. What can the government in Westminster do through working constructively with the Welsh Government to promote training and recruitment of GPs so these practices remain viable and sustainable?
Well, I think one of the things we can do is to share ideas with the Welsh Assembly Government. One thing we are pioneering here is to make sure that newly qualified doctors are offered special payments if they become GPs, and this is part of a £10 million plan that we have to recruit even more. In England, we have 1,000 more GPs working than we did back in 2010, and I hope the NHS in Wales, while it is underfunded by the Labour government in Wales, will look at creative ideas like this.
Speaker, Step Change has reported today that the average debt of Bolton residents is £11,000. Doesn't this show that my constituents are suffering because of his failure to deal with the cost of living crisis?
Her constituents are benefiting from the fact the economy is growing, our deficit is coming down, we're creating jobs, but we are dealing with the debt crisis which her government put in place in our country. That is what's happening, but every day the British economy and the British country is getting stronger. Every day Labour Party is getting weaker.
Last but not least, Mr Andrew Jones.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As a result of the focus upon earlier diagnosis, increased access to treatment and the latest medicines, 12,000 more patients every year are now predicted to survive their cancer than just 5 years ago. So will the Prime Minister agree with me that whilst this is very encouraging, there's a long way to go and we have to maintain our focus upon fighting cancer?
Now, I think my honourable friend is absolutely right. What we see in our country is a 50% increase in cancer referrals, which means that we're identifying cancers earlier and treating them better. We also have the Cancer Drugs Fund that has helped 60,000 patients, but we need to go on with these improvements. But we'll only be able to do that if we have a strong economy backing our strong NHS.
Order.